welcome. I'm Kamla. My guest today is Anja Manuel. She's a diplomat, lawyer, teacher, author, and a member of Rice Hadley Gates, a strategic consulting firm based here in Silicon Valley. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me, Kamla.
You're a very accomplished person. You're a diplomat, a lawyer, a teacher, and now the author of a book called This Brave New World. This is a book on India, China, and the US. When was the first time you visited China?
The first time I visited China was actually fairly recent. I think it was in 2005 or 2006. But my interest in Asia goes back so much further than that. So my father was actually a German diplomat, and I grew up in part in Abbottabad, Pakistan, which is right at the bottom of the Karakoram Highway, which leads to the wild west of China, and of course near the disputed border with India. So ever since then, Asia has been something that I've been fascinated by.
Oh, you grew up in Pakistan?
For several years, yes.
So do you speak the language or understand Urdu?
I spoke and understood Urdu when I was 6 and 7, and then I forgot it just as quickly as I learned it.
Okay. And then India?
India, the first time I visited India was actually in 1996. We spent all summer backpacking around, seeing it from a different perspective than I would now. And then, of course, I spent a lot of time when I was working for the US State Department. I was one of the negotiators of the civilian nuclear deal with India, so spent quite a lot of time there negotiating the deal. And now I'm there probably 2 or 3 times a year.
So you went in 96, which is when I think the economy opened up, the Indian economy. And 10 years later, you were part of the team that negotiated the civilian nuclear deal that ran into some problems. The deal was signed, but in executing the deal, there were some issues. What were those issues?
Well, this is a very complex deal. So India, as of course you know, never signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. They had very few nuclear weapons, a small nuclear weapons program, and India has always been a good steward of its nuclear technology. It has never proliferated, it has never sold its technology to anyone. We made the calculation, or President Bush did in 2005, that it was important to really bring India in as a strategic partner. We wanted a close partnership with India. And this was an issue that had been a sticking point for so long. India, of course, needs a lot of electricity. They need clean electricity and an alternative to coal if we're going to get climate change just right. And so this deal was negotiated. It was complex and difficult on both sides. And it was difficult both the negotiations between our two countries, but then also within our countries. So I tell a story in the book where Jai Shankar, who is now a famous Indian diplomat and a very wonderful counterpart in these negotiations, actually told us to take a break. And he would then go and negotiate with his own team internally while we would be off seeing museums in Delhi. And then we would reconvene several hours later and continue negotiating between the countries. On the US side, it was also something that was difficult. You know, I spent a lot of time with, at the time, my boss, Nicholas Burns, up on the Hill trying to get support for the deal. It's the first time that the Indian American community in the US really coalesced around an issue and was incredibly helpful. And ultimately, of course, in the US, it passed 92-8 in the US Senate. So it was a really important milestone, even though it's taken so long to implement, because it taught our two countries how to work together.
So what were the sticking points then after you negotiated the deal?
Well, the deal itself was complex, a lot of sticking points. Once we got over those, the most important one, and the one that's made it very difficult to implement, is that in every other civilian nuclear deal around the world, there is a limitation of liability for the companies that are going to build the nuclear power plants. And of course, that's difficult in India for historical reasons with the Bhopal disaster. And in the midst of all this, we had the Fukushima accident in Japan. So it made that a very difficult political issue in India. I now understand that it is mostly resolved. I think you may have seen when Prime Minister Modi was in Washington this week, he announced that some of the reactors are going to begin to be built, which is great, including American reactors, some French reactors and some Russian ones. Westinghouse, which is the American firm doing this, still thinks there are some things, some details that need to be worked out, but I'm optimistic that it will now go forward.
So do you think Ambassador Jaishankar played a key role because his father was a very well-known strategic thinker and writer, and I think he believed strongly in India being a powerful country, you know, Dr. Subramaniam. So I wonder if having Mr. Jaishankar on the team helped you all in some ways. When I say helped, push the negotiation in the right direction.
Yeah. Jaishankar at the time was sort of what would be our level of the Assistant Secretary for the Americas, sort of a mid-level diplomat. And he and Shankar Menon were really instrumental in getting this deal finished. We worked incredibly well with them. They were always unfailingly intelligent, thoughtful, and had their eye focused on the ultimate goal, which is what we hope we did too, which is to create a closer partnership between the United States and India.
So coming to your book, this is the first book that you've written, This Brave New World, India, China and the US. This is a fascinating and a very accessible book because you present all three countries in different ways, and there are all these anecdotes that you have embedded throughout the book. Why did you want to write the book at this time?
It's a very good question, and thank you for asking it. I, of course, have been working on these two countries and with these two countries for a long time. But I'm struck by the dramatic impact that both India and China are already having on all of us here in the United States and will continue to have. Let me give you some examples. By 2030, India and China will be the largest market for American companies. They will have 3 billion people between them, 100 million more of those in India than in China. So we will be selling to these enormous middle classes. Secondly, we can't solve the world's biggest problems without them. As it is, we are here in San Francisco. More than 20% of the smog that you get in California drifts over all the way from Asia. On climate change, we used to think we could solve the problems if the US and Europe could just get along, but that's no longer the case. China is the largest emitter of carbon and India is its fastest growing. So on those big issues, we absolutely need to cooperate. And finally, the military situation in Asia is getting more and more worrisome. So about half of the world's arms imports these days are actually going to Asia. Many of those to India and China, which, as you know, are increasing their defense expenditures. And unlike NATO and Europe, there isn't a real institutional glue that holds it together. So for all those reasons, we here in the United States should be paying attention. I feel like we're paying a lot of attention to China, although sometimes we don't know quite what to make of it. And we often ignore India, as evidenced by the fact that Prime Minister Modi was here meeting with Obama, and it hardly made the news.
That's true. But Mr. Modi is known as the foreign minister, I think, of India because he travels extensively. I think in his 2 years as a prime minister, he's been to the US at least 3 times. And President Obama has gone to India once, and that was a symbolic gesture. Having lived in Pakistan and being familiar with South Asia, you know how much that Republic Day matters in India.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's a great celebration. I love it.
Yeah, and so for President Obama to show up there was a great thing. What do you think, how do you think this thing is going to happen where all three countries can work together? You know, there is rising China, and India and the USA are kind of worried about that. China is aligning itself with Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and other countries. India has historically painted itself as a gentle power. It has never flexed its muscles. What do you think are the challenges? Because it would be in an ideal world, you know, the right thing to do for all three of them to cooperate. But how do you think this is going to happen? Because there are ups and downs.
Yes, there are ups and downs. And you are absolutely right to say that India and the United States see China in a very similar way. So when I was at the State Department almost a decade ago now, India wasn't much worried about China. but that has changed very much.
Why?
And I think the economic relationship between China and India has become stronger. At the same time, so the U.S. and India both have very important economic relations with China. Nobody wants those to fall by the wayside. We want to continue trading with China. What's difficult I'll speak for the U.S. first. On the U.S. side is that we feel like there isn't fair market access to China. They're coddling their national champions. We're worried about their cyber stealing of our industrial secrets. And frankly, we're worried about their assertiveness in the South China Sea and elsewhere. And I think India has similar worries. There's also a huge trade imbalance with China, just like there is with the U.S. and China. The incursions over the disputed Himalayan border they haven't led to any shooting yet. No one's been killed, thankfully, but it has people nervous. And I think even more nervous when I talk to friends in the Indian military is that Chinese submarines are increasingly active in the Indian Ocean, and as one admiral put it to me, are sneaking past our coasts. So there was more tension there. You asked, how do we resolve it? It's never easy, and this isn't a quick solution that you implement and then you're done. What I argue for in the book is a thoughtful, subtle policy that understands that we're going to have interests that differ in many situations, and I argue for having a clear and consistent line on this. So what do I mean by that? For example, the United States feels like China is overstepping its bounds in the South China Sea. And at the beginning of the Obama administration, we had a lot of freedom of navigation operations. We sailed our ships very close to these fake islands that China is creating. Then we stopped for several years.
Why are they creating those fake islands?
If you look at the world from China's perspective, we see them as very assertive and often aggressive. But look at the world from their perspective. Their lifeline is the ocean. Almost all of the goods that go into and out of China come from the ocean.
They're a strong literal state.
They are. 82% of China's oil goes through the Malacca Strait, this tiny, narrow strait. If the United States or another power were to shut that down, it would wreak havoc on the Chinese economy. Not to mention that their economic interests are expanding around the world. There are more and more Chinese people living in other nations, so they feel, understandably, that they need to protect them. And also, that first island chain that China likes to talk about is only a couple hundred miles off its shore. And it allows the United States and others to radiate power very, very close to the Chinese coast.
So according to the international law of the seas, is that high seas? After 200 miles, it's high seas, right?
It's high seas. This gets very, very complicated in the South China Sea because there are so many overlapping and complicated claims.
So you're a lawyer, so I just want to ask you this. Do you think China is somehow, by creating these fake islands, is changing the norms and customs and, how you occupy territories when it comes to international law and international sea? Is it tweaking in that? Is it fiddling around with that, if that's the right word I could use?
I think that is the intention. It's a little bit like when you're in the United States and you squat on a piece of land and you build a house there. If no one says anything about it for 20 years, you own that piece of land, right? That's in a way what China's trying to do in the South China Sea. Now, no one has accepted that. And in fact, there is an arbitration going on right now. China will probably lose in that arbitration. It's unclear whether they will accept the outcome. But so the island building in the South China Sea is very dramatic, and I have pictures of it in the book. Ultimately, I think it won't stand. But we need to be clear and consistent that that is not an appropriate line, that that's not where the border is, and we need to be multilateral about it. And importantly, if wherever possible, we need to ratchet down our public statements about this. Because one of the problems is that things are now so much in the news. You have someone from BBC and CNN flying with American pilots over the South China Sea, that there's very little room for the politicians in both countries to save face and to reduce the temperature of the conflict.
And that's a very important thing. Culturally speaking, saving face is a very important device.
Yes.
in the Asian context, whether it's
Absolutely.
Chinese or whether it's Indian.
Absolutely.
So, so there are these cultural differences. How do you help? Because you say that it is in everybody's interest to collaborate. So in an ideal world, we could do that, but we don't live in an ideal world. There are all these, like you said, journalists flying and seeing what is happening. That doesn't give room for maneuver to these politicians to say whatever they have to say. What is your prescription? Mm-hmm. Practical prescriptions that can be executed by politicians and policymakers.
Yeah. On the military side, clear and consistent lines enforced always. So don't do freedom of navigation operations, then stop them, and then start them again. It confuses everybody, right? It's a little bit, I have small children. When I change bedtime and it's later one night, you're never going to go to bed at 7 o'clock again. So we need to be consistent and we need to be multilateral. We also need to find in as many areas as possible, and military is the hardest of these, areas of cooperation. So, and that's not just a job for the government. That's a job for all of us, for business people going back and forth. I'll give you some examples. China and the United States at the end of 2014 negotiated a joint agreement on climate change, what steps each country was going to take to ameliorate the problem in our own country. That is a great opportunity for cooperation, similar to the civilian nuclear deal that we did with India. It teaches, it's not obvious how you get along with each other's diplomats. It requires practice. And this allows people to practice and to realize that they can have a joint project together. On the business side, it's already happening. There should be more of it. Our clean technology companies here in the United States are doing a lot of work in China. China invests twice as much in clean tech as the United States does. And they're trying to do a lot of work in India. Indian companies are working in China. The students are going back and forth between the two countries. And all of that we should promote and do a lot more of.
So people-to-people interaction.
People-to-people, business-to-business, and government-to-government.
Let's talk about India. In the book, you paint the history of both the countries, India and China, and how that informs the way they behave on the world stage. So China was a middle kingdom. It always was the center of the universe. So maybe that's why they're behaving the way they're doing now. That could be one line of argument for how they behave. India, on the other hand, people have come over the centuries and they've not been able to really conquer the country. The country, I think, ends up conquering them in some ways.
Yeah.
Right? You call it raucous democracy right now. It's a system that works. It has its own method of working. What do you think has changed under Prime Minister Modi when it comes to U.S.-India relations?
I think U.S.-India relations have been a gradual evolution, all in a positive direction, I think. And in the United States, this is something that's really bipartisan. So Clinton did a big trip to India at the end of his administration. George W. Bush doubled down with the civilian nuclear deal. Obama has done a lot. Obama proposed India for a UN Security Council seat, for example. And I think in India, you see the same thing. It used to be that India was understandably, it became a country in the late 1940s as currently formed. It had a bad experience with colonialism. And Prime Minister Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India, said understandably, we're going to be the representative of the world's downtrodden. We're not going to get involved in great power politics. And many of the diplomats, even the ones that I met, the Indian diplomats, were very much still steeped in this long-aligned movement. We don't want to be too close to Russia. We don't want to be too close to the United States. We don't want to be too close to anyone. I think as you get a new generation of both business leaders and government leaders in India, and Modi is a perfect example of that, there is less and less fear that you're going to be too close to the United States or that we'll be beholden to the United States. It's just a partnership that makes sense. And Modi has, I think, rightfully doubled down on it.
Who within the Indian system kind of resists working with the American government and with American business? There must be some bloc that kind of resists.
Yeah, and it's hard to generalize. It's just individuals. So some diplomats were just less comfortable being with the United States. The civilian nuclear deal had a difficult vote in the Indian parliament because some of the political parties were resisting. You see it less and less now, frankly, and I think the business leaders on both sides have been really instrumental because India wants to trade with the world and wants to be open. I would say, since you're asking a very specific question, I still see it a lot in our trade diplomacy. So where, military relations are great, diplomacy back and forth on a lot of different issues is fantastic. People to people is great, business to business great. Our trade relationship is slower than it should be.
Could it be because of the colonial history that India has? Because it was through trade that the British came?
Yes,
Could
absolutely.
that be the one that's informing their...
Absolutely. And I write about this in the historical chapter in the book, how inevitably all of us have stories that we tell ourselves. There's a history that is stronger in our collective memory, and that is exactly one of the stories in one of the storylines in India. And of course, with independence and with Nehru went to a closed system because the argument by Indian economists at the time was that the British had exploited India intentionally. So the idea was to grow Indian business until it was ready to stand on their own feet and then go and conquer the world. Well, my argument to India now would be, you're ready. You're ready to stand.
For free market.
And you're ready for free markets.
Okay. How surprised were you when you're writing the book and in your travels about the influence of America in various parts of India? For instance, the Constitution itself.
Yeah.
The gentleman who is known as the architect of the Indian Constitution studied in Columbia over 100 years ago.
Yeah.
And he was totally influenced by the American Constitution.
Right.
And the spirit of the Constitution. Then there's the film element, there is the music element, and I don't know if you used Uber when you were in India. Do you use Uber?
I have not used Uber in India yet. I tend to use the Indian taxis. But yes, of course, there's a huge amount of influence. And frankly, these days it's going the other way. I mean, how many of us here watch Bollywood? I've been to 2 Bollywood parties this year already.
Oh, really? Where? Here in the
Bay Area? And I'm struck by it, frankly. I see it more coming in this direction. I was struck when Prime Minister Modi was here in September, and he gave a business dinner in Silicon Valley, 500, 600 attendees. I think there were 5 CEOs on stage with them.
Yeah.
Big, iconic American companies. 3 of them are run by folks who were born in India. So there is a lot of cultural influence back and forth, and I think that's a positive thing. Keeps our relationship strong.
Let's talk about small business and doing business if a small business is interested in doing business in India, an American small business, what do you think are the challenges for them? Is it easy for them to navigate the waters and set up a business and get going?
It is very difficult to do business in India, as you might have experienced yourself. So I'm smiling because when I left the State Department in 2007, I actually considered setting up a business in India with an Indian partner. And we spent 6 months sort of studying this, and we just got so stuck in the morass of how are you going to buy the land, and this was a service business, it was a law business. How are you going to get the licenses, the license to operate, the environmental license? And it was just taking so long that, frankly, we gave up, right? And I think a lot of American businesses are discouraged by that. I hear it a lot. I hear it from my clients.
Things haven't changed in 10 years?
Things have changed a lot. And I think Modi is rightfully making a big push in this direction, starting with putting a lot of the simple things like the licensing online. And it's improving vastly. And it has improved very much in certain states and not in others. So when I tell my clients who are trying to do more business in India, I say choose the state, the Indian state that you're going to be in. It's not so much a country, but you can do a lot of business in Andhra Pradesh or in Gujarat or in other places.
Or Telangana, the new state.
Or Telangana, the new state. And it maybe, is your family from there?
No. But I know that Naidu was very pro, business when he was head of Andhra Pradesh.
Yes,
right.
He was.
Okay.
He was.
So you recommend that they go to states that are friendly.
It makes it much easier.
How easy is it for an Indian business person to do business in America?
It's interesting. I have less experience with that, of course, since I'm not an Indian business person doing business in America. what I tend to hear from foreigners, and I hear it mostly from Chinese, is great, it's a level playing field, but no one helps you at all. Right? So in contrast to China, where if you're going to invest, people will roll out the red carpet, they'll show you how to do it, they'll walk you through the licensing regime, they'll actively help you. Here, you're just sort of on your own. And I actually serve on a commission for Governor Brown that thinks through how to get more foreign direct investment into California and how to improve our exports out from California. And this is one of the things we're looking at is, we have a pretty even regime. We think it's pretty straightforward, but even starting a business here in California isn't always that straightforward. So we're looking into ways to make it easier for foreigners to invest here.
That's interesting. And I think you were appointed recently, weren't you?
It started about a year ago.
Okay.
Yeah.
Living in Silicon Valley, I just can't help but ask this question. Technology must be in your radar. You're also part of a startup? You sit on the board of a San Francisco startup?
Oh, I sit on the advisory board of, which is different, of
Yes.
2 San Francisco startups. And yes, of course, in the consulting firm that I run with Condoleezza Rice and others, we do a lot of work for Silicon Valley tech companies. And boy, is it fun. It's such a great time to live in this part of the world.
How is it fun and how is it different from your policy world?
Well, it's different. One thing that's striking is when you leave the State Department, you think all diplomacy happens government to government. But actually, so much diplomacy happens between people and between businesses. Let me give you one example. One of our clients several years ago was going to set up business in Vietnam, and they were thinking about hiring several thousand Vietnamese engineers. That is more aid than our USAID organization from the US government is ever going to give to Vietnam. So these relationships are really important. They're not always positive, but they're important. And then specific to Silicon Valley, our tech companies, they tend to be incubated here, but they're so quickly international. Before you know it, you're doing business in 80 countries and you're helping promote freedom of speech, or you're just getting people around with taxis. So it's something that these specific entrepreneurs here in Silicon Valley, how they internationalize is something that they have to wrestle with much more quickly than traditional companies.
My last question. How many languages do you speak?
Not that many. I speak German, of course, because I'm German, and English and Spanish, and then terrible French, because my husband is French, and almost no Hindi.
Well, you speak more than one language, Anja.
I do.
Anja, it was such a pleasure to have you, and hopefully you can come back and do another interview with us. We would love to have you back.
Thank you. I would love it. Such a pleasure to meet you, Kamla.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back again next week with another interview. Until then, goodbye. And thank you for watching. If you missed any of our shows, you can watch them on our YouTube channel. And I'll be back again next week with another show.